It was supposed to be the safest place in the world to let your guard down. So why did she feel like she was being watched? The sunlight spilled across the marble tiles of the resort courtyard, warm and golden, the kind of Florida afternoon that made everything feel slower, softer, almost unreal, and Naomi Carter stood right in the middle of it, her wide-brim hat casting a gentle shadow over her face as the ocean breeze lifted the edge of her linen dress, carrying with it the faint scent of salt and sunscreen and distant laughter, the kind of laughter that belonged to people who had never had to second-guess whether they belonged somewhere, and for a moment, just a moment, she let herself believe she was one of them, that this trip, this long-overdue vacation, was exactly what she and Ethan needed after months of late nights and unspoken stress, after too many dinners eaten in silence and too many mornings that started before the sun came up. This was supposed to be their reset, their chance to breathe again. And as she adjusted her sunglasses and glanced toward the infinity pool where turquoise water seemed to melt into the horizon, she exhaled slowly, steady, deliberate, like she was finally letting something go, but then she felt it, that subtle shift in the air, the kind you couldn't quite explain but couldn't ignore either, like a room going quiet a second too fast or a conversation stopping mid-sentence when you walk in, and her shoulders stiffened just slightly, almost imperceptibly, as her eyes moved. Not quickly, not nervously, but carefully, controlled, taking in the details around her, the couple lounging by the cabanas, the bartender polishing a glass behind the outdoor bar, the concierge speaking into a headset near the entrance, and then she saw them. Two uniformed officers standing near the edge of the courtyard, their presence out of place in a setting built on escape, their posture rigid, their eyes scanning, not the crowd, but her, and for a second she told herself it was nothing, that maybe they were just passing through, that maybe she was reading too much into it. Because she had promised herself she wouldn't do that here, not on this trip, not in a place where everything was designed to feel easy, but the longer she stood there, the more undeniable it became, the way one of them leaned slightly toward the other, murmuring something under his breath while his gaze never left her, the way the second officer's expression shifted, not surprise, not curiosity, but something colder, something already decided, and Naomi felt that familiar weight settle in her chest, not fear exactly, but recognition, the kind that comes from experience, from knowing how quickly a moment can turn, how fast a peaceful scene can fracture without warning, and still, she didn't move, she didn't run, she didn't even frown, because she had learned a long time ago that sometimes the strongest thing you could do was stand exactly where you were and refuse to shrink. And yet, even as she held her ground, even as the ocean breeze continued to brush against her skin and the sound of distant waves carried on like nothing had changed, everything had already begun to shift, because those officers weren't just walking past. They were moving toward her now, step by step, their shadows stretching across the polished stone, closing the distance in a way that felt slow and sudden at the same time. And somewhere behind her, just out of frame, Ethan Carter stood watching, silent, still, his expression unreadable, like a man who already understood how this was going to unfold, even before the first word was spoken. Naomi did not step back when they reached her, even as the noise of the courtyard seemed to dim around them, like the world itself was holding its breath, and the taller of the two officers, Ryan Mercer, stopped just a few feet away, his sunglasses hiding his eyes but not the certainty in his posture, the kind of certainty that did not come from knowing the truth, but from believing he did not need to question it. And for a moment he said nothing, just let the silence stretch between them, as if waiting for her to fill it, to explain herself without being asked. But Naomi had learned that silence could be power too, so she held it, steady, calm, her chin slightly lifted, her expression composed, until finally he spoke, his voice even but edged with something sharper beneath the surface, asking if she was a registered guest at the resort, the question simple on its face but heavy with implication. And Naomi answered without hesitation, her tone polite, measured, confirming that she was, that she and her husband had checked in just an hour earlier, that they were staying in one of the oceanfront suites, details offered clearly, confidently, the way someone speaks when they have nothing to hide. But Mercer did not nod, did not apologize, did not step away. Instead his gaze shifted briefly to his partner, Blake Dawson, who stood slightly behind him, arms crossed, scanning Naomi in a way that felt less like observation and more like judgment. And then Mercer asked for identification, not as a request, but as an expectation, and Naomi felt that familiar tightening in her chest again, not because the request itself was unusual, but because of the way it was delivered, the way it assumed compliance without respect, the way it ignored the context of where they were, a private resort filled with guests who were not being stopped, not being questioned, not being asked to prove they belonged. And still, she reached into her bag slowly, deliberately, aware of every movement, aware of the eyes now turning toward them, the conversations around them softening into whispers, and she handed over her identification with steady hands, watching as Mercer took it, glanced at it for only a second before looking back up at her, as if the document itself was not enough to change whatever conclusion he had already reached, and then he asked another question, this time about how long she planned to stay, about the purpose of her visit, questions that moved beyond verification and into something else entirely, something invasive, something that suggested this was no longer about confirming her reservation, but about testing her presence. And Naomi answered again, each word chosen carefully, each sentence controlled, even as she could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on her, the contrast between the bright, open sky above and the narrowing space she now occupied. And just a few steps away, Ethan remained where he was, leaning casually against a stone pillar, as if he were just another guest enjoying the afternoon. But his eyes never left Naomi, not for a second, his posture relaxed but precise, the kind of stillness that comes from discipline rather than ease. And when Mercer's tone shifted just slightly, when his next question came with a hint of skepticism that was no longer subtle, Ethan's expression changed too, not dramatically, not enough for anyone else to notice, but enough to signal that something invisible had just crossed a line, and Naomi felt it at the same time. That quiet, unmistakable moment when a situation stops being uncomfortable and starts becoming something else, something that would not resolve on its own, something that would demand to be answered. The question hung in the air longer than it should have, stretching the moment into something heavier than a simple conversation, and Naomi felt it settle around her like a quiet pressure, the kind that does not shout but still demands something from you, something more than answers, something closer to submission, and yet she did not give it, not in her posture, not in her voice, not even in the way she breathed, because she had learned long ago that once you start shrinking to make someone else comfortable, it never really stops. So instead she stood exactly as she was, shoulders relaxed, gaze steady, and repeated her answer with the same calm clarity, explaining that they were visiting for the weekend, that they had planned this trip for months, that everything about their stay was already confirmed, each word measured, each sentence grounded in quiet confidence. But Mercer did not seem interested in the content of her response, only in the fact that she was giving one at all, as if the act of questioning her was the point, not the answers themselves. And when he tilted his head slightly, when his lips pressed into that faint, almost polite line that did not quite reach sincerity, it became clear that this was no longer about verifying anything. This was about control, about establishing who had it and who did not. And Naomi could feel the shift ripple outward, the way nearby conversations faded into low murmurs, the way a couple seated near the pool paused mid-sentence, their eyes flicking over just long enough to take in the scene before looking away again, not wanting to be involved, not wanting to choose a side. And that, more than anything, made the moment feel colder, because silence from others has a way of amplifying everything that is happening right in front of you. And still, she held her ground, even as Mercer handed her identification back with a motion that was just a little too abrupt to be neutral. And then, without missing a beat, he asked her to step aside with them, just for a moment, he said, just to clear something up, his tone smooth but firm, leaving no real space to decline. And Naomi felt the weight of that request settle in her chest, because she knew what it meant, not legally, not formally, but emotionally, socially. The implication of being moved out of the open, of being separated from the space she had just been part of, and for a brief second, she considered it, considered whether complying would make this end faster, easier, cleaner, but something in her resisted, something quiet but unshakable, the same instinct that had carried her through moments like this before, telling her that moving would not resolve anything. It would only confirm what they already believed. And so she did not step aside. She did not argue either. She simply remained where she was and asked, politely, why that would be necessary when she had already provided everything they requested. Her voice steady, respectful, but unmistakably firm. And that was when the tension changed again, sharper now, more defined, as if an invisible line had just been drawn between them. And Mercer's expression shifted in a way that was almost imperceptible but impossible to ignore. The slight tightening of his jaw, the narrowing of his focus, the subtle drop in the warmth of his tone as he responded, repeating the request but this time without the soft edges, and behind him, Dawson adjusted his stance, his arms uncrossing as he stepped a little closer, not touching, not intervening, but present in a way that made the space feel smaller, more confined. And Naomi could feel her heartbeat pick up just slightly, not out of fear, but out of awareness, the recognition that this moment was no longer just uncomfortable. It was pivotal, that whatever happened next would shape everything that followed. And just beyond them, Ethan shifted his weight for the first time, pushing off from the pillar with a movement so subtle it could have been missed entirely, except it was not by Naomi, and not by the situation itself, because there was something about the way he moved, something deliberate, something controlled, like a man stepping into a role he had been avoiding until he absolutely had to. And even though he had not spoken yet, even though he had not raised his voice or drawn attention to himself, the air seemed to respond to him, tightening just slightly, as if the moment had been waiting for him all along. And Naomi felt it too, that quiet shift behind her, like the first sign of a storm you cannot yet see but somehow already understand is coming. The space between them tightened in a way that could not be undone, and Mercer no longer bothered to soften his tone as he repeated the request, this time with a firmness that carried the weight of expectation rather than courtesy, telling Naomi that it would be easier for everyone if she simply cooperated, a phrase that sounded reasonable on the surface but felt anything but, because it suggested that the situation itself was already her responsibility to resolve, as if she had created it, simply by standing where she was. And Naomi felt that familiar flicker of frustration rise beneath her calm, not explosive, not visible, but present, steady, controlled, and she met his words with the same composure she had held from the beginning, asking again, clearly and respectfully, what exactly needed to be cleared up, because she had provided identification, because she had answered every question, because she had done everything that was asked of her without resistance. And for a brief moment there was a pause, a small fracture in the rhythm of the interaction, as if Mercer had expected compliance without question and now had to adjust to something else, something he did not quite anticipate. And that pause did not soften him. It sharpened him, his posture straightening, his voice losing what little neutrality it had left as he responded that there had been a report, vague and unspecific, about someone matching her description moving through restricted areas of the resort. And the words landed with a weight that was both familiar and infuriating, because they carried just enough ambiguity to justify scrutiny while revealing nothing concrete. And Naomi let that sit for a second, let the logic unfold in her mind, because she knew what that meant, not just in terms of the moment, but in terms of the pattern it represented. The way suspicion could be constructed out of nothing more than appearance and assumption. And still she did not raise her voice. She did not argue emotionally. She simply responded with clarity, explaining that she had arrived less than 60 minutes ago, that she had walked directly from the front desk to the courtyard, that she had not entered any restricted space, and that if there was confusion, it could be resolved through the resort staff who had checked her in, her tone steady, grounded, offering a solution instead of escalating the conflict. But Mercer did not take it, his gaze remaining fixed, his stance unmoved, as if the facts themselves were secondary to the authority he was asserting. And beside him, Dawson shifted slightly, his presence becoming more active now, not intervening with words but reinforcing the atmosphere with proximity. And Naomi became acutely aware of the eyes around them, the subtle shift of bodies, the quiet hum of attention that had grown into something undeniable. People watching, not openly, not boldly, but enough to turn the moment into something public, something exposed. And that was when Mercer reached the point where suggestion became instruction. telling her that she needed to come with them to a quieter area so they could continue. The phrasing polite, but the expectation absolute. And Naomi felt the weight of that decision press against her again, heavier now, because it was no longer just about her comfort. It was about her dignity, about whether she would allow herself to be moved, repositioned, handled in a way that implied she did not belong in the very space she had paid to be in. And for a second, just a second, her fingers tightened slightly around the strap of her bag, a small, almost invisible reaction, but one that carried the weight of everything she had experienced before, every moment like this that had forced her to choose between ease and principle. And then she spoke, her voice calm but unmistakably firm, stating that she would prefer to remain where she was and resolve any misunderstanding in the open, where everything could be seen, where nothing needed to be hidden. And the words settled into the air with a clarity that could not be ignored. And Mercer's expression hardened in response, not dramatically, not aggressively, but enough to signal that the balance had shifted again, that this was no longer a simple interaction but a standoff of presence and will. And just behind Naomi, Ethan took another step forward, closing the distance slowly, deliberately, his movement quiet but purposeful, until he stood just within the edge of the moment, not interrupting yet, not announcing himself, but close enough now that his presence could no longer be dismissed as background. And for the first time, Mercer's attention flickered, just slightly, drawn not by what Ethan said, because he had not spoken, but by the way he stood, the way he watched, the kind of stillness that does not belong to someone uncertain. And in that brief, almost imperceptible shift, something changed, something subtle but undeniable, like a door beginning to open that no one there was fully prepared to walk through. The moment did not explode. It tightened, like a wire pulled just a little too far, and Mercer's attention shifted fully now, no longer split between Naomi and the situation, but drawn toward Ethan with a quiet suspicion that had not been there before, because there was something about him that did not fit the pattern Mercer expected, something in the way he stepped forward without urgency, without hesitation, closing the space beside Naomi not as a reaction but as a decision already made. And when he finally spoke, his voice was calm, level, almost conversational, asking a simple question about what exactly the issue was, the kind of question that did not challenge authority directly, but did not submit to it either. And Mercer responded with the same explanation, though now it sounded slightly different, less certain, less controlled, repeating the vague report, the mention of restricted areas, the need to clarify. But Ethan listened without interruption, his expression steady, his posture relaxed in a way that suggested he was not intimidated by the uniforms in front of him. And when Mercer finished, there was a brief pause, just long enough to let the weight of the explanation settle. And then Ethan nodded once, slowly, as if acknowledging the words but not necessarily agreeing with them. And he glanced briefly at Naomi, a silent exchange passing between them, something unspoken but understood, before his gaze returned to Mercer, and he asked another question, still calm, still measured, about whether the resort management had been consulted before approaching a guest in this manner. And the phrasing was careful, precise, not confrontational but unmistakably pointed. And for the first time, Mercer hesitated, not visibly, not in a way that would draw attention, but enough that the rhythm of his response broke slightly, and Dawson shifted beside him, his stance tightening, as if sensing that the dynamic was beginning to change in a way he could not fully control. And around them, the quiet audience had grown more attentive, the subtle glances now lingering longer, the whispers a little more defined, because something about the interaction no longer felt one-sided. It no longer felt like a simple stop and question. It felt like something else was unfolding, something that had layers beneath the surface, and Naomi stood in the center of it, her presence still calm, still composed, but now supported by something that had not been visible before, something that shifted the balance without raising a voice. And Mercer seemed to feel it, even if he could not yet name it, because his tone changed again, this time attempting to reassert control by narrowing the focus, telling Ethan that this did not concern him, that they were simply conducting an inquiry, that it would be resolved quickly if Naomi cooperated. And the word lingered there again, cooperated, repeated like a key that was supposed to unlock compliance. But Ethan did not react to it. Not emotionally, not defensively. He simply responded with the same calm precision, stating that if there was an inquiry, then it should be based on clear information, not assumptions, and that Naomi had already provided everything requested, and the clarity of his words, the lack of hesitation, the absence of any need to raise his voice, began to shift the energy in a way that could be felt even by those standing several feet away, because authority, when it is real, does not need volume. It carries itself in stillness, in certainty, and Mercer's jaw tightened slightly as he listened, his posture holding but no longer expanding, as if something unseen had placed a boundary he was not used to encountering. And for a brief second, the sunlight, the ocean breeze, the distant sound of waves all seemed to return, as if reminding everyone that this place was meant to be something else, something peaceful, something ordinary, and yet here they were, standing in the middle of it, caught in a moment that was anything but, and Naomi felt that shift as well, not as relief, not yet, but as a subtle realignment, a sense that the weight she had been carrying alone was no longer hers to hold by herself. And as Ethan took one final, quiet step forward, placing himself fully beside her, not in front, not behind, but equal, the space between all of them settled into something new, something balanced, something waiting, because the next word spoken would no longer belong to just one side of the story. There are moments when a situation does not need to escalate to reveal its truth, moments when everything that matters is already visible in the silence between words, and this was one of them, because as Ethan stood beside Naomi, the dynamic had shifted in a way that could not be undone, not loudly, not dramatically, but undeniably, and Mercer felt it, even if he refused to acknowledge it. Because authority that is challenged without confrontation becomes uncertain, and uncertainty is something men like him are not trained to navigate. So instead of stepping back, he leaned into it, repeating that they were simply following procedure, that there had been a report, that it was their responsibility to investigate. But the words sounded thinner now, less grounded, as if they were being held together by habit rather than conviction, and Ethan listened again, not interrupting, not reacting emotionally, just observing, the way someone does when they are not trying to win an argument, but to understand exactly where the truth ends and the assumption begins. And when Mercer finished, Ethan nodded slightly, his expression unchanged, and then he spoke, his voice still calm, still even, but now carrying a clarity that cut through the moment without needing to raise volume, stating that procedure, when done correctly, includes verification from the establishment before confronting a guest publicly, that it includes identifying a specific concern rather than a general description, and that it certainly includes maintaining respect throughout the interaction, and each point was delivered without accusation, without hostility, but with a precision that made it difficult to dismiss. And Mercer's response did not come immediately this time, because for the first time, he was not just responding to a situation, he was being evaluated within it. And that realization, subtle as it was, changed everything, because it meant the interaction was no longer one directional. It was being seen, measured, and understood from a perspective he had not accounted for. And Dawson glanced at him briefly, a silent question passing between them, not about what to do next, but about whether this was still as simple as it had seemed at the beginning. And around them, the atmosphere had shifted again, the quiet observers no longer just watching Naomi, but watching all of them, the balance of attention redistributing itself in a way that made the officers just as visible as the person they had approached. And Naomi felt that shift deeply, not as relief, but as a recognition that the moment had moved beyond her alone, that the weight she had carried was now part of something larger. Something that could not be controlled by a single voice or a single assumption. And still, she remained composed, her posture unchanged, her presence steady, because she understood that the power of this moment did not come from reacting. It came from holding firm, from allowing the truth to surface without forcing it. And Ethan, standing beside her, seemed to operate from that same understanding, because he did not escalate, he did not demand, he simply asked one more question, quiet but direct, about whether there was any actual evidence connecting Naomi to the report they mentioned, and the question landed with a weight that could not be ignored, because it stripped the situation down to its core, removing the layers of tone and posture and leaving only the substance. And Mercer opened his mouth to respond. But for a brief second, nothing came out, because the answer was not there, not in a form that could hold under scrutiny. And in that pause, in that single moment of hesitation, the entire interaction revealed itself, not through confrontation, not through force, but through absence, the absence of justification, the absence of clarity, the absence of anything that could truly support what had been set in motion. And Naomi felt it, that quiet shift from pressure to exposure, the moment when being questioned turns into something else entirely, something closer to being seen. And as the ocean breeze moved through the courtyard again, lifting the edges of her dress, carrying with it the distant sound of waves, it felt as though the world was gently reminding everyone present of what this place was meant to be, and how far this moment had strayed from it. And standing there, between the sunlight and the silence, it became clear that whatever happened next would not be decided by authority alone, but by something far more difficult to control, the truth that had already begun to surface, whether anyone was ready for it or not. The silence that followed was not empty. It was full, heavy with everything that had not been said and everything that could no longer be ignored. And Mercer felt it pressing in from all sides, not just from Ethan's question, but from the space itself, from the eyes now openly watching, from the shift in attention that had quietly but completely moved away from Naomi and onto him. And for the first time since he had stepped into the courtyard, he was no longer the one defining the moment. He was inside it, exposed to it. And that realization did not sit easily. So he adjusted, straightened slightly, cleared his throat, and began to respond again, this time more carefully, choosing his words with a precision that had been missing before, stating that they were acting on information provided and that it was their duty to follow through. But even as he spoke, the certainty was no longer there, not in the same way, because duty without clarity begins to sound like justification. And Ethan did not interrupt him, did not challenge him mid-sentence. He simply listened, his expression steady, his presence unchanged. And when Mercer finished, Ethan reached slowly into the inside pocket of his jacket, the movement deliberate, unhurried, the kind of motion that does not seek attention but commands it anyway. And for a brief second, both Mercer and Dawson tensed, not out of fear, but out of instinct, their focus narrowing onto that single action. And then Ethan brought his hand back out, holding a slim, dark credential wallet, and he flipped it open with a quiet, practiced motion, revealing a badge and identification that caught the sunlight just enough to be unmistakable. And he held it at a level where it could be clearly seen, not pushed forward, not forced into their space, just presented. And his voice, when he spoke, did not change in volume, but it carried something new now, something that did not need to be explained, stating calmly that his name was Ethan Carter, that he was a federal agent, and that he was currently off duty but fully aware of the standards required when interacting with civilians. And the words landed differently than anything before, not because they were louder, but because they carried weight, the kind of weight that shifts a situation instantly without needing to escalate it. And Mercer's reaction was immediate, though controlled, his posture tightening, his eyes focusing more sharply, the earlier edge in his tone replaced by something more measured, more cautious. And Dawson's stance changed as well, his shoulders lowering slightly, his presence no longer expanding but retracting just enough to acknowledge what had just entered the space. And around them, the quiet audience felt it too, that sudden recalibration, the invisible line of authority redrawn in a way that no one could deny. And Naomi stood between it all, feeling the shift move through the moment like a current, not overwhelming, not chaotic, but undeniable. The pressure that had been on her now dispersing, not disappearing, but redistributing itself in a way that felt balanced for the first time since this had begun. And Ethan did not press further. He did not raise his voice or issue demands. He simply closed the credential wallet and held it at his side, his gaze steady on Mercer as he added, with the same calm precision, that if there were legitimate concerns, they could be addressed properly, through the resort management and with clear information. But that what had occurred so far did not reflect that standard, and the clarity of that statement left very little room for interpretation. Because it was not an attack, it was an observation, and observations, when grounded in truth, are difficult to argue against. And Mercer nodded once, slowly, as if processing not just the words but the entire shift that had taken place. And when he spoke again, his tone had changed completely, the sharp edges gone, replaced by something more formal, more restrained, acknowledging that there may have been a misunderstanding, that they would verify the report with management, and that they appreciated the cooperation. And the word, this time, sounded different, no longer a demand but a recognition. And as the tension began to ease, as the air seemed to open back up around them, Naomi exhaled quietly, not in relief, not fully, but in awareness of what had just happened, how quickly a moment could shift when truth stepped into it. And as the ocean breeze returned, brushing softly across the courtyard, it carried with it a quiet reminder that some forms of power do not need to be announced. They only need to be revealed at the right moment. The shift did not end the moment. It transformed it. And as Mercer stepped back slightly, his earlier certainty replaced by a more measured restraint, the energy in the courtyard began to settle into something quieter, something more reflective, like the aftermath of a storm that never fully arrived but still changed the air, and Naomi could feel the difference in the way people around them now looked, no longer with quiet suspicion or distant curiosity, but with a kind of awareness that had not been there before, an understanding that something had just unfolded that was not as simple as it first appeared. And Mercer, now more deliberate in his movements, reached toward his radio, speaking briefly and calmly, requesting confirmation from resort management, his tone professional, controlled, but unmistakably different from the one he had used moments earlier. And Dawson stood beside him, no longer expanding his presence but holding it carefully, as if aware that every movement now carried weight. And as they waited, the silence returned, but it was no longer oppressive. It was balanced, shared, and Naomi stood in it with the same composure she had held from the beginning, though inside there was a quiet processing taking place, not of fear, not of anger, but of recognition, because this was not new, not entirely. The pattern, the assumptions, the way a moment could be shaped by perception before facts ever had a chance to speak. But what was different this time was how it had shifted, how it had been met, not with escalation, not with retreat, but with clarity, with presence, with truth allowed to stand on its own. And a few moments later, a resort manager approached, moving quickly but not hurriedly, his expression a mix of concern and professionalism, and he addressed the officers first, confirming that Naomi Carter and her husband were indeed registered guests, that they had checked in earlier that afternoon, that there had been no report involving them or anyone matching their description in restricted areas, and the words were clear, direct, leaving no room for ambiguity. And Mercer nodded as he listened, his posture straight but no longer rigid, acknowledging the information with a brief response. And then he turned back to Naomi, his tone formal, controlled, offering an apology for the inconvenience, stating that the situation had been a misunderstanding, and while the words were correct, while they followed the expected form, they carried a different weight now, because apologies given after exposure do not erase the moment. They only acknowledge it, and Naomi received them with the same calm she had maintained throughout, not dismissing them, not engaging further, simply accepting them as part of what had already unfolded. And Ethan remained beside her, silent now, his role no longer active but still present, his earlier intervention settling into the background like something that had done exactly what it needed to do, no more, no less. And around them, the courtyard slowly began to return to its original rhythm, conversations picking back up, movement resuming, the sound of laughter drifting again across the open space. But something subtle had changed, something that would not fully disappear, because moments like this leave traces, not always visible, but felt. And as Mercer and Dawson stepped away, their presence receding into the broader setting, Naomi stood for a second longer, letting the air move around her, letting the weight of the moment settle into something she could carry without being defined by it. And then she turned slightly toward Ethan, their eyes meeting briefly, no words exchanged, none needed, because everything that mattered had already been understood. And as they began to walk together toward the oceanfront path, the sunlight stretching out before them, it became clear that what had been interrupted was not broken, that the peace they had come for had not been taken, only tested. And in that quiet continuation, there was something stronger than before, something grounded not in illusion, but in truth that had already proven itself. The ocean stretched out in front of them, endless and calm, the late afternoon sun casting a golden path across the water as Naomi and Ethan walked side by side along the stone-lined path, their pace unhurried, their silence no longer heavy but settled, like something that had been carried and then quietly set down, and for a while neither of them spoke, not because there was nothing to say, but because some moments do not need to be filled with words to be understood, and Naomi let her gaze drift toward the horizon, her fingers brushing lightly against the railing as the breeze moved through her hair, and she thought about how quickly everything had shifted, how a place that had promised rest had, for a moment, tried to take something from her, not her safety, not her belongings, but something less visible and far more personal, her right to simply exist without being questioned, and yet she had not lost it, not this time, because she had held her ground, because she had chosen not to shrink, and because when the moment demanded it, the truth had stepped forward beside her, not loudly, not forcefully, but clearly, enough that it could not be ignored, and Ethan glanced at her then, a quiet check-in, the kind that does not need to be spoken aloud, and she met his eyes with a small, steady nod, not a gesture of reassurance, but of acknowledgement, because they both understood what had happened, not just the surface of it, but the deeper pattern beneath it, the way assumptions can move faster than facts, the way authority can sometimes lean on certainty that has never been questioned, and the way dignity, when held firmly enough, can reshape a moment without raising a voice. And as they reached the edge of the overlook, where the path opened up to a wide view of the shoreline, Naomi paused, resting her hands lightly against the cool stone as she took in the scene, families walking along the sand, children chasing the tide, the steady rhythm of waves meeting the shore again and again without hesitation, without doubt, and there was something grounding in that, something that reminded her that the world was larger than a single moment, larger than a single encounter, and that what had happened back in the courtyard did not define her. It revealed something about the space, about the people in it, about the quiet lines that exist whether they are acknowledged or not, and Ethan stood beside her, his presence no longer protective in the way it had been before, but simply there, steady, equal, and after a moment he spoke, his voice low, reflective, saying that situations like that do not always end the way they should, and Naomi let that settle for a second before responding, her tone calm but certain, saying that this one did not end because of who he was, it ended because of what was true, because even before he stepped forward, she had already known she belonged there. And that knowledge had not come from a badge or a title, it had come from something deeper, something that could not be taken or granted by anyone else. And Ethan listened, then nodded once, understanding the distinction, because power, when it is real, does not come from what you carry in your pocket, it comes from what you refuse to give up when someone tries to take it from you. And as the sun began to dip lower, painting the sky in shades of orange and soft blue, Naomi took a slow breath, letting the air fill her lungs fully this time. And in that moment, there was no tension, no weight, just the quiet certainty that the day was still hers, that the peace she had come for had not been lost, only tested, and that sometimes, the most powerful thing you can do is stand still, say nothing, and let the truth arrive exactly when it is needed, because he thought he was in control of the moment, but that day, control did not belong to him. It belonged to the truth she never let go of.